Hello and welcome to Mikey Learns. Today is September 17th, 2020, and we'll be covering a SharePoint Reddit post titled Centralized Office Listing. The OP says, I've asked this question before many months ago, maybe someone has implemented something since. I'm looking to create a centralized list that stores contact information like address, phone number, division, etc. Currently we are on premise. However, below in the comments the OP says that they're now going to SharePoint Online. Anyways, we've got dozens of copies of the same list all over different site collections, and the reason we do that is because we use lookups to update other lists with hundreds of locations that the list is located in. When an update occurs every quarter or so, it's a pain to update all these lists. So you wouldn't have a solution. So I did post here a quick reply to this post. I think that there's two very viable solutions. Both require Power Automate. It is where I found out that the OP says they're moving to SharePoint Online and that they have Power Automation licensing, which is a very cool tool that can definitely help with this use case. So these videos, I try to do them in one take, no editing, and I think that that's a great way to do these kinds of videos as long as I'm presenting concisely, and I believe that's great because it helps you guys understand where I am mentally as I build through these things. Sometimes when I do these builds, though, I'm gonna have to pre-build larger parts because the video would just be too long. So this today is one of those videos where I had to pre-build most of the solution in advance of the video. So we're going to walk through solution one here, the bullet point number one, which is what we're going to do is we're going to create a master list somewhere, which is a site called master site in this demo I'm about to show you. And then we're going to use flow, where if a change occurs to the master list, then we're going to propagate that change to all the copies spread out everywhere else. So in that case, the other everywhere else is a site called site one and site two. Alright, so moving over to the SharePoint assets that I've stood up in advance of the video, we have a master site with a list called location list. This is going to be the master list. Then we have a site 1 with a list called site 1 and a site 2 with a list called site 2. My advice to the OP would be we need to clean up that master list before we deploy the solution. And then once we clean up that master list, we're going to create a template of that list and deploy it across all the sites that need a copy. I'm not going to go into how to do that. There's plenty of links out there on the internet. Just search, how to turn a list into a template in SharePoint Online. It's just a couple clicks to do it. The one important thing you're going to want to do though is you're going to want to include the content. You're going to get to a screen where you're creating the template on the master list. You're going to want to. There's a checkbox that says include content. You're going to want to do that because then when you deploy the list to all the sites that need a copy, it's going to grab not only the list and all the columns and the views, but it's also going to grab the data. And what's significant to retain when deploying the solution is the unique ID for all the list items. Because I was doing testing before this video, the list is blank right now, but the ID is actually going to start at 10 when I go to demonstrate this. So just so you know. Alright, so once you deploy a copy of the template across all the sites, we then need to go into Flow. Alright, so in Flow, we have a flow that's triggered by when an item is created or modified. Now, if your master list never needs to account for deletion of items, then we just need this flow. If you need to also account for use cases where a list item can be deleted from the master site list, then we need to create a secondary flow or a separate flow, and the trigger would be when an item is deleted. Okay. Now, if you have to create the deletion flow, the flow is identical to these top three steps in addition to this right hand side. You would just mirror this whole right side to include the top half. That's how you would do that flow. And everything would be the same. You would mirror all the settings. However, the difference would lie within two places. You don't need this condition, so just erase it, as well as this terminate, you don't need it. And then these update items actions, these would actually be delete items. So you would delete an item from site 1, delete an item from site 2. If you have 10 sites with 10 lists, then you're going to replicate this step 10 times. As well as this get item step, you got to replicate that too. But I'll go into that here in a minute. Alright, so we want to look at the master site, the master list, when an item is created or modified. Now what we need to delineate between is a newly created item and a modified item. And The easiest way to do that is to use the unique ID of the master list item that's being created or modified, and then cross compare that with one of the copies. And why you want to do that is if you go to cross compare the unique ID of the master list with, say, one of the copies, and there is no match, then that means it's a new item being created on the master list. So you're going to have to create a new item on all the copies. Now, if there is a match between the master list and one of the copies, as far as the unique ID goes for the list item that triggers the flow, if there is a match, then we know that we're updating an item. Hopefully that makes sense. Cool. So we're going to move on. Ignore the variable stuff for now. I'm going to cover that later. That has no, technically the variable part of this flow here, as well as this condition here, they don't technically impact the performance of the flow or the functionality of it, but it does help keep the flow log clean, which is a huge pet peeve of mine. I hate seeing fails when flows are actually succeeding. I'll show you what I mean here in a few minutes. So ignore the variables for now. All right, so we're going to first do that cross comparison between the master list and site one. Site one being one of the copies, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to do get item. You could do get items with an S. However, when you do get items, it forces you to use an apply to each across the flow everywhere because it assumes that there could be more than one item. I hate dealing with the apply to each because of get items. So where and whenever possible, I try to use get item. So what I'm doing is I'm getting item from site one's list, which is the copy, one of the copies, and I'm getting the ID on that list equal to the ID from the trigger. All right. So if there's an item with the ID of 1 on the master list and an item with the ID of 1 on the site one's list, which is a copy, then this action here is going to succeed. If there is no match, so let's say that there's one item on the master list and no items on site one's list, then there's not going to be a match because item ID 1 does not exist on site one's list. Therefore, this action is actually going to fail. And what we're using, instead of using something more traditional like a condition to validate that pass or fail condition, we're actually using run configure afters and scopes. If you don't know what a scope is, they're not too commonly used. A scope is a way of building a container, putting a set of actions in that container, and having that entire container perform a set of actions, uh, all as one container. So, all right. So to not reiterate, but to continue on, the left-hand side of this flow, the scope called if fail, is if this ID does not match. Therefore, we need to create an item. The right-hand side of the flow, the if success side, is for if there is a match from this ID to this list, and then we need to update an item. Okay. Once again, ignore the variables, and we're going to cover the left-hand side, the if fail side first. All right. So when there is no match, we need this scope to run. And because when there's no match, this action fails, we need this entire scope to run if this step fails. So we have to configure the run after to be if get item site 1, this action has failed. Okay. If that has failed, this entire scope runs. Ignore the variables. What we're going to do is we're going to create an item on all of our copy lists. So in this particular demo, we have site 1 and site 2, so 2 copies. And in the create item action, there's no ID, so don't have to worry about it. And what we're doing is we're grabbing the trigger step, the master list, the item's value. So column 1 and column 2, I'll show you real quick on the list. It's only a 2-column list, column 1, column 2, okay? We're just taking the value from the trigger and overriding, well, in this case we're creating an item, so the value doesn't exist. But we're going to populate the column 1 value with the column 1 from the trigger, and the column 2 value in the column 2 from the main list. Same with the create item 2 here. This is just for site 2's list. Same thing. These values come from the trigger, okay? And then that would be a success, all right? Over on the right-hand side, this is the if success side. This is where if the ID of the modified item is equal to an ID of a given item, whatever item it might be, well, on site 1's list, where the IDs match, we know it's an update. All right. Now in this particular example, this kind of hints back to what I was talking about a few minutes ago. In this particular example, I have two sites, site 1, site 2. So I need to get the item from both lists that pertain to or have a matching ID to the trigger, the master list ID. So I already have site 1's item here in this action. It's already pulled into the stack. So now I just need site 2's ID. So that's my first step in this scope. Okay. Actually, backing up like a couple seconds. If this fails, that's when this side happens, right? If fail. And the configure run after is set for if fails. Okay. I want this side just to be the default if success. Okay. If there's an ID match, we want to run this scope. So, all right, that's how we get into the scope. All right, so now moving on. We need to get site 2's ID, right? So we can update site 2's item, all right? So now we have site 1's item and site 2's item, and we have the respective item necessary to update. Now we're just going to run an update item for each site. The ID here, I just pull it from the trigger body itself. At this point in how this flow is built, the ID value is simply just a numerical value I'm leveraging. It doesn't really matter where this ID comes from. It does have to come from one of two locations in the flow. It either has to come from the trigger step or the list item that you're validating against. Okay, because those are the two IDs that are in question here. So when you go to update, say 10 lists and you're updating them all over here, this ID value, this dynamic value should be equal. You should grab the dynamic value from the trigger or the copied list that you're validating against. Don't grab it from one of the other copies that aren't involved in the validation step up at the top. Alright, so once you have all your update items out there, you just update your list item for each site. These column 1, column 2 values are the same thing as over here. You're just grabbing the value from the trigger. So in this case, you're overriding the existing value. So site 1's item, probably, let's say it had a value of 1, and now the update is value 2. Like, you're just overriding it. It's pretty straightforward. And we'll run through an example here in a minute. Alright, so I'm going to collapse these real quick and cover why the variables are in here. Alright, so before this video I ran some tests, obviously, and so I want to look good on cam. These fails here, these are actually successful flows, but like I said, I hate seeing fails when they're actually a success. So what happened was, in this particular case, it was a situation where the item was newly created, and I was creating items. So the left-hand side here, the if fails, actually succeeded. The item's actually created, but because when you do branching, which are these where it delineates left to right, when you do branching in flow, both sides have to pass through. You have to pass through both branches for the flow to succeed, or you have to set an artificial termination that declares it as success, which are what these terminates are down here. All right, so what happened is, because it went down the left side, the right side was skipped because these actions weren't performed. The criteria wasn't met for this scope to run, so it was a skip. So what it did is it backtracked to the last point in time of what happened. It determined that there was a fail. Furthermore, it didn't go through that scope, so it fails. Nothing happens, the flow worked as intended, but I hate seeing that in the log. So what I did was I incorporated a way of building in variables to do some checks to make sure that the flow is running as intended, and then create an artificial success at the end. Okay. So I just created a variable. It's a string variable called terminate. Initial value is initiate, and then because the problem lies in the fact that the creating item side, the if fail side, is what's causing the right hand side to fail, I need to address or create a way to influence the right side to be success. And so how I did that is, when I branch and go into the two scopes, if it goes into the right side, it's going to, well, the whole right side's configured where if this step is a success, right? So if this step succeeds because there's a match, it's a modify. Anyways, I'm digressing. I apologize. If we go down the create item side, we determine that this variable should be set to pending, okay? And then once the item is created successfully, we determine the value as success, okay? So how does that work? All right, so over here, this scope is configured to run if this is a success. If not, it gets skipped, okay? So we're going to have this condition run if the scope is skipped. Okay. So in the case where the create item is made, or where the create item side is run, and the scope over here on the right side gets skipped, this condition runs, and it goes, is terminate equal to pending, which is the start of this scope. Well, it's going to be yes. Okay. So what I do is I set in an artificial delay of 30 seconds to give some processing time here for these two create items. Nothing is instantaneous. If you have to update or create items on like 10 lists, you might want to change this delay to be like 1 minute, just to give it enough time. Okay. So I'm going to give it 30 seconds, and then I'm going to assume that that is enough time. When you're doing your testing, if you're constantly, if it determines this isn't enough time, then start bumping it up until it gets to a reasonable amount of time, where it's like 100% success. Anyways, delay happens for 30 seconds. Another condition occurs. Is terminate now equal to success? Now, terminate would be equal to success once all the items are created. Okay. So if it's equal to success, we terminate the flow with successful succeed. Okay. If not, what you could do is have another delay or prolong this delay so that the yes side is met here. However, 30 seconds for me was plenty long enough. I had like 25 seconds of extra time. So if it's still not equal to success in condition 2 at this point in time, there's probably a problem going on. So what I need to do is set this up so that it alerts me that there's something going on. And how I do that, because I'm a sole developer where I am, um, the default canceled value, you have your failed, succeed, and cancel. Canceled to me means that the flow is mostly working, but it's caught up somewhere. And I know where that somewhere is because I'm building the cancel in here. Okay. So that's how I handle that type of error handling for me. Okay. All right. So you might be saying, okay, well, how do I bypass this condition? Like if I'm going down this side of the branch, the success side, and these update items occur, I don't want this condition to run because like this side's not running over here. Like that, the create items aren't happening. So I have this run if the scope is skipped, right? Because the left side's running. Now, if the scope runs though, because this item, this action is a success, if this scope runs, all right, and it gets to this step, what it's going to do is it's going to skip this one, okay? And because this is determined to be a skip, I'm going to configure this terminate to be if the condition is skipped, okay? If the condition is skipped, then I still want to succeed the terminate the flow with success. All right. That's gonna that methodology is just gonna keep all of that is just to keep the flow log looking clean. You could literally not do any of that. You could skip this condition, you could skip this terminate, and you could remove the variable in the 3 locations, and the flow will work fine. But you will see fails in the log, which I hate, as I've told you already like 5 times. All right. So on to the demo. We're gonna just create two items, or one item really. This is item 10. All right. Keep in mind, this is the master list. Keep that in mind. But keep in mind, I do have a trial tenant, so flows can take up to a minute to run. Now, this is a new item. When I go into the flow log, I expect it to go down the if fail side, and I expect that right hand side's condition to like perform operations, like the delay of 30 seconds, and then I expect it to all succeed. I expect the run to ultimately succeed. All right, so once it starts running, it's going to have that 30-second delay. I'm going to actually go into it and show you what's going on as it's going on in real time. So we're running right now. All right. This step failed, and it failed because it's a new item, so it's going down the if fail side. The variable's already all set, right? The items have already created, and this delay is processing right now. So for me, like I told you, 30 seconds is probably already too long, okay? But you definitely want to have it so that this delay lasts longer than it takes for these items to create with some buffer room, okay? So at 30 seconds here in 5 or so seconds, this condition is going to process as a skip, or rather a cancel, and then it's going to go to the down the yes side where the artificial succeed is put in. All right. So, all right, cool. Worked as intended. All right. So here's the main list. This is item 10, ID 10. Come over here, refresh these two lists. There already are. We refreshed. So site 1, ID 10. This is item 10. Site 2, same thing. Perfect. all the data matches. It all got replicated from creating the item here. Alright, so now I'm going to edit this item on the master list. Let's call it item 100 in column 2. Alright, we're going to wait for this flow to occur again. Now this time I would expect it to go down the other side. Alright, it's going to update the item on these two lists, site 1, site 2. Okay. Alright. In the meantime, we'll cover something else. Since that's the last part of the demo for the actual functional part. The solution 2 here is, in my opinion, the cleaner way to do this, but number 1 matches more closely with what the OP I think is asking for, so that's why I'm demoing option 1. Option 2 is going to be more of like, let's have a master list with a bunch of data, and then we have a bunch of other lists that need to pull data from that master list, but only like certain values, right? We're not trying to necessarily replicate because those other functional lists serve other purposes, but we do need to fetch some data from the master list. So it's kind of like the master list acting like a traditional database, and all your other lists are kind of those more functional lists that feed or funnel or facilitate some other process. Now, you could use Flow to fetch the data from the master list, but on those associated lists, like those child lists or the more functional lists, you need a way to track the association between that list and the master list. The best way to do that is to leverage the unique IDs on the master list, and you just use that ID, that value, to do the lookups. So like when I'm updating this functional list over here, I need to look at the unique ID, call it 10, right? Then I go do a get item from the master list, looking for ID equal to 10, right? And then grab whatever fields I need, and then I'm using Flow this whole time. Grab ID 10, grab whatever fields I need, and then do an update item back over to the more functional list. All right. So that's how like number 2 in theory would work. I can build a demo for this if you guys want. Just let me know in the comments. All right. Just let me know. All right. So back over to here, we've got this is a master list. This is item 100. This is item 100, and this is item 100. So it works successfully. All right. The flow log should be a success. Down the right hand side, the if success side. Cool. We're good. Alright. Now, earlier I said the branch has to go down a success on either side for the flow to be successful. What I did was, if it goes down the right hand side, I know it's working as intended, just by the nature of how it's working, right? The ID is matched, I'm updating the item. As long as it passes through and gets to the end, it's going to be a success. So I declare the flow to be a success by adding in this last terminate, okay? So regardless of the fact that this is skipped over here, the flow is deemed to be a success because of this last terminate, which kind of explains why this case here doesn't align with what I said earlier. Hopefully that makes sense. Alright, cool. So I'm going to leave a or a link rather, to this post, this Reddit post, inside the video description. Let's help this person out. If you guys have any further details you want to give them, go on and post up. If you want me to demo, say number 2 here, or have questions on the demo I did here today, just let me know in the comments, or just post in the thread. Now that I've posted, I'll get alerts. So do look forward to talking again with you guys tomorrow. Take care. Have a great evening.